So the first thing I did was I brought all the teams together here in Arizona. Let's see. Before I selected Lockheed, I interviewed all the team members. So we interviewed British Aerospace, I interviewed Matra, I interviewed the Europeans as well, and we finally settled on Lockheed. And before I selected them as a partner, I interviewed all the team members to make sure they were ready for change, number one. And then when I selected them, I said, you cannot build the satellite buses in Sunnyvale. You cannot build your buses in your low quality, high cost factory. So I made Lockheed set up a new commercial line, and all the Lockheed buses were built in Nashua, New Hampshire. So I made them set up a new line. And I made Raytheon do the same thing for the phased array antennas. So that was part of the selection criteria. Then, once they were selected, then I started training them in Motorola's best commercial practice. I'll watch you a little closer, Jonathan. It's hard to find good help, isn't it? Probably comes from my government days. So one of the first things I did was I took the Motorola commercial manufacturing courses, and I trained my Lockheed team. So I took the courses to the Lockheed team. I trained Lockheed on commercial design for manufacturability, design for Six Sigma quality, and I took the executives to Chicago, and I took the executives through the Motorola commercial processes as well, because you have to have the whole team has to be on board. It's all about organizational dynamics, right? Because it's very difficult for an organization to change. I mean, it's like I was in the Air Force, and I was building unmanned aircraft, my second tour of the Air Force, and it was clear to me that when I was doing this, here I was doing away with pilots, right? I was building unmanned aircraft, doing away with pilots, but pilots were going to determine whether I got promoted. So I switched to satellites, right? And today, the Air Force, you know, we've seen recently where Gates, 2 years ago, had to fire the Air Force's Chief of Staff, the #1 4-star in the Air Force, to get him to buy into using Predators and unmanned aircraft in a significant way over in the sandbox, which they're doing today. And anyway, way back in '09, I was building unmanned aircraft and killing tanks and doing all those things, but when you have an organization whose power hierarchy are pilots, it's hard for them to promote unmanned aircraft. Similarly, in the space business, when you have a management hierarchy who's built their success on building satellites a certain way, it's hard for them to change, right? So that was one of the biggest things that Durrell and I fought the whole time, was changing. Iridium is the only commercial satellite manufacturing program ever done in the U.S., and it's not going on today. Not all of this has gone away. Hell, all our satellites are back to the old way of doing things. So let's see. So I trained Lockheed on all these things, and I brought the teams together, the program was fixed price. So there is a private placement memorandum on the street. So I had designed the cost, and I brought the teams together, and the satellite design is triangular. About half the cost of putting a satellite in orbit is the rocket cost. So if you look at a rocket, the top of a rocket is round. The most effective use of that is a pie-shaped. And the rockets drove our satellite design, first of all. They were one of the drivers. And so the basic design of our satellite is triangular, so we could maximize the use of rockets because the rockets are like 50%, 40 to 50% of the cost of putting stuff in space. So they, of course, became a driver. And then the other thing that we did was let's see, when you design a piece of hardware, when the initial design determines the quality of the piece of hardware you build. And once a design is set, you can only test out on reliability. You can't test in more reliability. The design of a piece of equipment determines its reliability. The approach, I ran a PDR and a CDR in my factory right along with the satellite. And we designed our factory in parallel with designing the satellite. And the other thing is the only satellite that's been horizontally built here in the U.S. is Iridium. All the low quality factories, the satellites are designed where you put stages together one on top of another, and engineers and technicians are leaning over, putting things in, and they're dropping stuff on the satellites. It's the worst design. And the Iridium satellites were designed to work horizontally, and I factored the horizontal loads. Some of the highest loads in the horizontal loads in the Iridium satellite came from the factory. So we had to design the factory, and I'll show you a picture later on. The satellite, all work was done at waist level on my satellites. So we designed the factory for a high quality approach. I have one war story. So I launched on the Russian big Proton rocket. We put 7 satellites on a Proton at a time out of Baikonur. We had 7 satellites on Proton, 5 on the Delta, 2 on the Long March, 2 on the Chinese rockets. So I went over to Russia, right, and of course the Russians are very efficient on their manufacture of rockets and executing space stuff. They have 3 Protons. They process horizontally these big Protons off the pad. When you finish processing one Proton, including the satellite, you lift the whole Proton on a rail car, and 3 days to launch it. So you take it from the processing facility on the rail car day 1, you take it out and you lift the rail car as well as a rocket, and you guide the rocket down on the launch pad. I mean, the largest hydraulics I've ever seen. And then day 2, the Russians drink coffee. Day 3, they fuel and launch. So you spend 3 days on the launch pad. With Delta at Vandenberg, I spent 6 weeks on the launch pad. They put stage 1, and then you'd put a solid on, then you put another solid, and then you put stage 2, and then it took me 6 weeks on, and so of course I was bragging to the Russians how innovative I was with horizontal processing of satellites. And of course the Russians said, "Danny, what took you so long? We've been processing space hardware horizontally for 40 years. What took you so long to do a cost-effective approach to space hardware?" So I was kind of quiet after that.